Thank you all for being here today. I appreciate it very much. I did some talks here 3 or 4 months ago now, I guess, and I talked about the fact that I'd written a book, and I'd written a book on the Intertestament period, and it's called The Bridge to the New Testament. Here's a paperback copy of it, and I started writing this back. I taught a class on it in 1994 on the Intertestament period, and I discovered there was not very much information on the Intertestament period, contemporary information. There's quite a bit from the ancient writers. So when I was teaching the class, I had trouble coming up with material to kind of fill in my knowledge of that time period. So at the time, I said, I need to fix that. I need to write a book about the Intertestament period. And I thought I'd do it in 6 months. I never said I was the smartest guy ever. That was pretty naive thinking, actually. I spent 25 years writing it, off and on. Published it about a little over 5 years ago now, and it turned out to be quite the tome because I just kept writing. I couldn't stop writing. In fact, I wrote beyond the period of the Intertestament period. I shouldn't have done that. I wrote on in through the New Testament period, on up through the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and then even beyond that to the fall of Masada a few years later. And then I said, I got to stop writing. I can't cover the Bar Kokhba revolt that happened later. I got to stop at some point, so I did stop there. So there is some stuff in the book that is not in the Intertestament period. But anyway, the book is called The Bridge to the New Testament. So the class and thank you, Donnie Moore, I don't know if he's in here or not, but I appreciate him giving me this time to talk about this class, this period of time, Intertestament period, for about the next 6 months. And the outline is here, just a general outline. If you have a copy of the book, you'll notice that the outline that I've got up here is basically a copy of what's the chapter headings of the book. There's 16 chapters in the book, and these are basically the chapter headings. Today we're going to talk about some introductory material that will go into next week also. Well, actually 2 weeks from now. Next week we have our gospel meeting starting, our little mini gospel meeting. So 2 weeks from today we will finish up introductory material, and then we'll jump into all the other topics. The Old Testament review, we'll talk about the empires, the Greek, Ptolemaic, Seleucids, empires, the Maccabean period, the Hasmonean dynasty, the Herodians that came along, Herod the Great and his sons and grandsons and what they meant, the Roman prefects, procurators, legates, and governors. We'll cover all who those people were. We will, as bonus material, cover the Roman conquest of Galilee, Jerusalem, and Masada, which is beyond the period of the Intertestament, if we have time to do that. We'll talk about Roman history and government. We'll talk about Jewish institutions, the temple, the Sanhedrin, things like that. We'll talk about the writings of the Intertestament, the Apocrypha, the Septuagint, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Torah. There's so many writings, there's just a bunch, the Targums. There's so many different writings of the Intertestament. We'll cover all those as time goes on. We'll talk about money and weights. It's a very interesting topic to me. If we read about widow's mite in the New Testament, what does that really mean? Well, that means nothing. It means nothing. The widow's mite, that was something that the King James people understood in 1611. It means nothing to us today. So what is a widow's mite? Well, it's actually a Jewish lepton or a pruta. Okay? That's what it really is. Well, how much does that cost today? How much does that really mean today? So I've done some calculations to show that. We'll talk about life in the ancient world, and we'll talk about the bigger picture and review. Now, it doesn't look like that much material, but it's a huge, huge amount of material. And I apologize up front, and I think you'll see my style of teaching. You'll either like it or not. I hope you like it. But I'm going to throw it out there like a fire. You've heard the expression, drinking from a fire hose, right? That's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be covering a lot of material in a fairly short amount of time. 6 months is not very much time for covering this material. And you'll see that starting today, because I'm going to talk about the calendar and how the ancients reckon time. So first of all, introduction-wise, I will be giving away, I don't have my mugs up here. They're back there with my wife. But I'll be giving, if you find errors in the book, if you do happen to have a copy of the book and you find errors that I don't have already marked in my book, this is my master copy of errors in the book. If you find those that I haven't found, I'll give you a notepad or a notebook or a mug. So see me after class if you found those errors. If you are the kind of student that really likes to dig in to material, you are already behind. You need to, if you are that kind of student and you like to read ahead or whatever, then you need to read chapter 1 and probably even chapter 2. Probably chapter 1 will get you through the next 2 or 3 weeks of the book. I'll give you sections to read every week if you want to do that. And also, if you want to dig in material, hopefully you're familiar with Roman numerals. We'll cover some of that as we go along. If you're just a student that just wants to attend class, that's fine. That's me. I was a horrible, horrible student. It's amazing I graduated. I was a pretty good student, but I never read the assignments. I never did homework. Not never, but I really was a bad student when I was growing up. Kind of embarrassing. If you happen to want to copy the book, please see my beautiful wife back there in the black jacket. By the way, please go to her and offer her your condolences. She is now married to me a little over 24 years. We just had our 24th anniversary. Hoorah. All right. Also at the bottom of the chart, of each chart, I'll have a page number if it's associated with a certain page in the book. All right, first of all, we're going to cover time. Now, if you are familiar with the book, we're kind of scooched over about halfway into chapter 1. We're going to cover the rest of the material in chapter 1, the first half of chapter 1, and the last third of chapter 1 next time in 2 weeks. And the reason we're doing that is because this subject of time, the subject of calendars, the subject of weeks and days and minutes and time is a very complicated subject. It's a very deep subject. It's a very long subject. And I wanted to try to cover that in one period if I could today. And I debated about whether to put the chart up front or behind of why it's important, because it is important. And I decided to put it at the end. So I'm going to show you all material first, and you're going to say to yourself, why? What does this have to do with anything in the New Testament? Well, I'll show you at the end. And again, I debated whether to put that chart at the beginning or the end. So how did ancient civilizations measure time? We're talking about square time. Calendars are little square dates on your calendar. And we got circle time, clock time. So that's the way they measure time. That's the way we measure time today. So let's start out back a long time ago. The Egyptians, their earliest date is about 4236 BC. We find records of that in the archaeological records and whatever. The ancient Egyptian year was 365 and a quarter days. Wow. That's amazing that they were able to come up with that so long ago. And one reason they were able to do that was because the Nile River is very predictable. It floods at certain times, and they had something called a Nilometer. And a Nilometer could be as simple as a farmer go out in the field and driving a stake in the ground, and when the Nile floods, he measures the certain time of year when it gets up to this mark, and then it goes down, and then the next year it floods and gets to this mark, and it's the same mark pretty much year after year. And that's kind of cool, actually. And then as kings came along, in fact, in the Ptolemaic period, which we will cover in detail, which is between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Ptolemies built Nilometers. The Nile River, measuring the Nile River. They may be called Nilometers, I don't know. But they would actually dig big wells into the ground. And they would mark, they'd have a series of staircases down in the ground, and they would mark on the staircase where the Nile River flooded to. Very accurate piece of time. And that was important to them because of their agriculture. The Nile River would come and it would flood all these vast lands and deposit all the silt and everything, and they were able to produce, they were kind of the grain basket of the Middle East back in that time. The Egyptians had 12 months of 30 days each, and they added an additional 5 days based on the different, and they named them based on the different gods that they had at the time. By timing the rise of Sirius, which is the dog star, and when they line that up with the rising sun, this eventually led them to conclude that a year was 365 and a quarter days. This was a long, long time ago they were able to do this. Now, what they were measuring, turns out, was the sidereal year, which is different from our tropical year. I'm not going to get into that right now, but because the Earth does this, the Earth wobbles. And because the Earth wobbles, the time that the equinox is lined up with the sun through a certain point is different from the time that a certain star rises on the horizon. That's all I'm going to say about that. I can talk to you later about what the difference between a sidereal year and a tropical year. But what they were really measuring was a sidereal year. In 238 BC, Ptolemy III ordered a leap year every 4 years. That's amazing. This was back before Jesus walked the earth. that they were able to figure this stuff out. The ancient Chinese, Greek, and Jewish years were based on lunar calendars, unlike the Egyptian calendar, which was a solar calendar. They looked at the moon. When the moon was new, it was black. There was just barely a sliver. You could see the moon was there because it was blotting out the stars. That's all you could see. So that would start their new month. And the moon doesn't line up with the sun. The moon's doing this around the earth, and the earth is doing this around the sun. And those two don't line up. So if you go by a lunar calendar, all of a sudden, after a few years, you're starting to plant crops in the middle of January instead of in March or April or whenever you normally plant crops. So that was a problem for them. The Jews still follow a lunar calendar today. If you go to Israel, if you keep up with Jewish holidays, you will become painfully aware of this. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. The main calendars to us were Roman. The first calendar that we're interested in was founded by Romulus, who was the founder of the city of Rome in 753 BC. Some modifications were made to that calendar by Numa Pompilius in 713 BC, and I'm going to talk about some of the details later. Julius Caesar made a serious major reform in 46 BC, and we followed the Julian calendar. George Washington followed the Julian calendar until we changed to the Gregorian calendar. The Gregorian calendar by Pope Gregory III came about in AD 1582, but we and the British didn't adopt that. The American colonies did not adopt that until the 1700s. I'll explain some details of that in just a minute. So the Romulan calendar, by the way, you look at Star Trek and if you're a science fiction fan, Star Trek, Star Wars, there's nothing new there. I mean, everything, the Romulans, the Romans, Remus, Romulus, they pick all their names. Numa, all these, Naboo, you remember the planet of Naboo? Yoda, that's the Jewish, everything they picked was from ancient literature, ancient sources. It's kind of interesting to me as I go through. I could do a whole talk just on Star Wars, the Star Wars universe, and how it lines up with the Romans, the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, and how the empire started coming about, how people started gaining more and more power. Anyway, we'll talk about that someday, but not during this talk. So Romulus formed the first calendar. It was a lunar calendar. March 1st was the first day of their year, and it only had 10 months. Lunar calendar of 10 months. So if you look at their calendar starting in March 1st, that's why September means 7. Septem means 7. That's our 9th month. That doesn't make sense. Octo means 8. An octagon is an 8-sided figure. Octo means 8. But it's our 10th month. Novem means 9, but it's our 11th month. Decem means 10, but it's our 12th month. What is going on? What is going on? Well, Romulus didn't have all the answers, but a guy named Numa Pompilius came along, who was the second king of Rome. And in 713, he made some changes to the calendar. It was also a lunar calendar of 355 days, not quite up to 365 and a quarter like we have today. But he added a couple of months to the calendar. Januarius, I bet you can't guess what that became, and Februarius. What an idiot. He added no disrespect to Pompilius, I'm sure he was a fine guy, but he added the numbers to the beginning of the months to the beginning of the calendar, January and February. That's why Septem 7 is now 9. That's why Octo is now 10. That's why November 9 is now, getting confused, is now 11. That's why December 10 is now 12, because he added the months to the beginning, and that threw everything off timing-wise. Oh my. Also, that threw off the start of the year. If he just added January and February to the end, things would have been so much better. But that threw off the beginning of the year. So now March 1st starts the year in the middle of the year. Julius Caesar came along and changed some more of that. He changed the year to 365 and a quarter days, effective on January 1st, 46 BC. It was a solar calendar, instead of a lunar calendar of 12 months. He added consistent leap years every 4 years. This was a huge, huge upgrade to the calendar.
You think that was because of the influence of the Egyptians on him?
Yes, in fact, there's stories about him visiting Cleopatra. Yeah, when he visited Cleopatra and then became her lover and stuff, he did talk to some of the Egyptian people who had been working on the calendars. Very, very, very heavy Egyptian influence. Yep. Anyway, March 1st used to be the start of the year. Caesar decreed that January would now become the beginning of the year, January 1st. The calendar actually was off by 80 days by the time Julius Caesar came along and did his thing. So he needed to add 80 days to the calendar. So it turns out that in 45 BC was a very long year. It's 445 days long. It's called the Year of Confusion because they had to add these 80 days to line up the solar calendar, the sun, with the, they wanted to stop planting their crops in January or July or whenever they were planting their crops because everything had gotten so off kilter by that time. So he added 80 days to the calendar. That year, 445 days long. He made the month links very logical. Starting in January, 31 days. February was weird. February's always been weird, 28 or 29 days. And then March was 31 days. April 30, May 31, 30, 31, 30. Very consistent, very, very amazing calendar that he came up with. The problem was, after Julius Caesar was assassinated, the Senate decided, we kind of like Julius Caesar after all. Let's name a month after him. And they changed the month of Quintilis to July, after Julius Caesar. And it had 31 days. Under the Julian calendar, it had 31 days. Well, after Augustus became emperor, and I think this was after he died, they decided, Augustus was a pretty good guy. He was actually the first emperor. A lot of people think Julius Caesar was, but Augustus was, who was Octavian before he became Augustus, the emperor. So they said, we need to name a month after him. So let's change the name of Sextilis to August. But there's a problem. August only had 30 days. Oh, no. He can't have fewer days than Julius Caesar had. Well, we got to make August have 31 days. That's why we have to deal with 30 days, September, April, June, and November. Anybody know that ditty? Yeah, that's how I keep up with it. That's why we have that. The Augustan reforms after Augustus got his month named for him. Julius Caesar had it all figured out till they messed it up. Now, the Romans had a really strange system of keeping up with fixed points on their calendar. They had something called the calends, the nones, the ides, and the pretty. Boy, talk about complex stuff to keep up with. Let me see if I can explain. Again, I know, we're all drinking from fire hose here. I have trouble wrapping my head around this, and I've studied it. So don't fret if you don't get it right away. So the calends was the first day of the month. Easy peasy. The nones was either the 7th day of the month or the 5th day of the month, depending on how long the month was. Okay. So far, so good-ish, I guess. The ides was either the 15th of the month or the 13th day of the month, depending on how long the month was. Y'all ever heard of the ides of March? Beware the ides of March, said Shakespeare when he was writing his play, Julius Caesar. The ides of March, March 15th. Julius Caesar came in the 1600s, I think, somewhere in there. So Europeans still understood the ides, the nones, the pretty. They understood all these terms up and through the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages. Yeah, pretty cool. Until you start trying to deal with it. So the pretty was the day before one of the fixed points. Days were also always specified before these fixed points. Let me explain. And just as an aside, they also use the nomenclature of AD, ante diem, before the day in official documents, because everything was before the nones, or the ides, or the calends, or whatever. So, for example, April 2nd. We're walking along the street, and I asked Kenny, I said, what's the date? He says, April 2nd. 2,000 years ago, if we were walking along the street in Rome, what's the date? He would say, AD 5 nones Aprilis. of April. Or 5 knowns, for short, 5 knowns. This was 4 days before the knowns. The knowns was either before the 13th or the 15th of the month, and March was a long month, so it was before the 15th of the month, so we're 4 days, actually 5 days before the knowns, because the knowns was counted as the first, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 was 4 days before the knowns. Okay? All right, the calends was the first of the month. The knowns, since it's a long month, was the 7th of the month. The day before was also always called the pretty. So if asked what day it was, and they say pretty knowns, I mean, they know, I would know that that's the day before knowns of that month. So pretty knowns was never 2 knowns, it was always pretty knowns. 3 knowns was 2 days before the knowns. 4 knowns was 3 days before the knowns, because they count the knowns as that first day. Okay, does that make sense? Same thing for when you get to the Ides. You have pretty Ides, which is the day before Ides. You have 3 Ides, which is 2 days before Ides, and so forth and so on. When you get past Ides, then you come to 14, 15 calends. So we start measuring from the beginning of the next month. How did they keep up with all this stuff? This is amazing to me, that they kept up with it. How did they have any kind of society whatsoever in trying to keep up with all this is just beyond me. So thankfully we've gotten beyond that today. Our calendar is now called the Gregorian calendar, and it's kind of our calendar. It was established in 1582, is that right? 1585, 1582, yeah. In 1582 to be 365 days, 5 hours, 48 minutes, 20 seconds, and that's still off by some, off by about 26 seconds. It's just like the Julian calendar, except we drop 3 leap year corrections every 400 years. And the way they do that is they measure, as they look at it, like the year, when a century marker comes around, like 2000. You know, some of you were here back in 2000, hopefully most of you were here back in 2000. If you're 24 or 5 years old or more, you were here in 2000. So in 2000, that year was a leap year. Y'all remember that, right? The reason that is because 2,000 divided by 400 is 5, equal 5. 1900 was not a leap year, because 1900 divided by 400 is not an even number. 1800 was not a leap year. 1700 was not a leap year. 1600, was a leap year. 1600 divided by 400 is an even number of 4. So the way Gregorian calendar works is that if it's divisible by 500, by 400, then it's still a leap year. If not, then it's not. That's how he took out 3 days every 400 years. And this really lined the calendar up. In fact, this lined it up so well that we've been using it ever since, except we kind of don't anymore. And I'll explain that in just a second also. So, interestingly enough, it probably would have been amended in 1300s, mid-1300s by Clement IV, or VI rather. But the bubonic plague happened to come in and take over all of Europe. And about a third of all Europeans died during the bubonic plague. If Clement had amended the calendar instead of Gregory 200 years later, it probably would have been accepted much, much faster, because the Roman Catholic Church had a much firmer grasp over all of Europe 200 years earlier. When Gregory came along, the Protestants were coming along, and the Protestants weren't interested in doing anything that the Catholics mandated, like Pope Gregory the 13th. The British and American colonies did not accept the calendar until 1752, whereas the rest of the world, the Catholic world particularly, accepted it back in the 1500s, and they ended up removing 10 days out of the calendar to line the Gregorian calendar back up with the Earth. Since the Americans and the British waited till the 1700s, it had drifted another day, so they had to end up taking 11 days out. In fact, George Washington had to deal with this himself. He was born on February 11th, 1732, under the Julian calendar called Old Style, OS, Old Style calendar, and he was born on February 22nd, 1732, under the New Style calendar. If you're an American historian, I'm not, but if you are, If you're truly a historian, you go back and look at ancient documents like I do sometimes, you will see OS or New S, old style, new style. If you see old style, you better correct your dates if you're going to write a book or something. You better correct those dates and bring them over to the Gregorian calendar from the Julian calendar. Japan in 1873 accepted it, Russia in 1917, Greece in 24, and China didn't accept it until 1949. Now the entire world, except for a few small holdouts, are on the Gregorian calendar, kind of. This is what the years look like. When Pope Gregory made his declaration, October went from October 4th of 1582 to October 15th of 1582. Another year of, they didn't call it the year of confusion like they did back in Caesar's day, but it was another year of confusion. Back when the British Parliament declared it, they went from Wednesday, September 2nd to Thursday, September 14th. So they're taking days out of the calendar. Anno Domini, AD, the year of our Lord, and Antichristum, before Christ. Anti means before in Roman and Latin. It was devised by Dionysius Exiguus in AD 525. No year zero in this calendar because it hadn't been invented yet or figured out yet what zero really is. If you look at all my charts in my book, unless I've missed one, which is possible, but all of my charts that span from BC to AD will have a zero time on the chart. And at that time, I'll put it in quote marks because there was not really a zero time. That was not, they didn't understand that back then. So Dionysius was wrong. Jesus was not born in 0 AD, 0 BC AD, that little microsecond between. He was born sometime between 6 BC and 4 BC, likely. I mean, different people have their different ideas. I actually wrote a chapter for this book that I took out of the book because the book was getting so large and I was having trouble finding people to publish it. I wrote a chapter on the life of Jesus, and I go through a long argument about why I think it's probably 6 BC, but different people differ on that. Some people think it's 5, some people think it's 4. The term before Christ came later, probably around 1627 AD, and it's also known as BCE, before the Common Era. So lunar calendars, we still got those hanging around. The Jewish and Islamic calendar are still lunar. Greek and Roman goddess of the moon had 3 faces. I don't even know why I put that in there, just ignore that. Just another little detail. There's been much effort over the centuries to line up the lunar and the solar calendars. It's called the Metonic cycle. I'm going to read you what I have here because this is about my understanding of the Metonic cycle. So 7 years of 13 lunar months followed by 12 years of 12 lunar months would equal almost precisely 19 solar years, and that would line up the solar calendar with the lunar calendar every 19 years. A-okay, good. Now the Jewish calendar intercalates, inserts a month every 3 years in their calendar. Now, if you are saying to yourself, what all does this have to do with anything in the Bible? When is Passover? When is the Feast of Tabernacles? When is Yom Kippur? All these things we read about in the New Testament, all these things that happen, they are based on a lunar calendar. The poor Jews, how do they figure all this out? If you're a Jew on the street and I go up to you and say, when's Yom Kippur this year? And you're going to say, oh, let me look at my phone. It's a lunar calendar. It can vary between this date and this date over a period of a month or so. Whereas on the street today, I can go up to Kenny and say, when is Christmas? December 25th, you big dummy. When is Independence Day? July 4th, you big dummy. Even Thanksgiving, well, I don't know exactly what date that is, but I know I can go to my calendar and look, oh, it's the 4th Thursday of the month. The Jews don't have that luxury. All their feasts, all their holidays were just mixed up jumble because they're based on the lunar calendar. And this lunar calendar that's corrected every 3 years just before the month of Nisan. And we'll talk about the month of Nisan here in just a minute. The Jewish year numbering starts at the time of creation according to what they've calculated out. To get the Jewish year, you add 3,761 to the Gregorian year. So 2024 is now 5785 to the Jews. This time ticks over on Tishri the 1st. Tishri is the beginning of their civil year, the Jewish civil year. Nisan is the beginning of their Jewish religious year. Okay, so this ticks over on the beginning of their civil year, Tishri 1st. So I have an actual calculation of Jewish time versus Gregorian time. And I have a calculator on there that will calculate, if you put in a Gregorian time, it will calculate and give you the Jewish time. It'll give you the years, the Jewish month, and the Jewish day. It even gives you the Hebrew for that. I know nothing about Hebrew. It's just a calculator that I incorporated in my website. So you can go look at that. TestamentPress.com will show you a Jewish time calculator along with several other calculators on there. We'll talk about that I'll get this working by the time we cover money, because I have a pretty comprehensive money calculator on there too. How much was a denarius? How much was a pruta? How much was a Roman as? How much was a quadrans? Whatever. You can go and calculate those things out. So anyway, there's two Jewish calendars: Nisan, religious years, and Tishri, civil years. They are lunar calendars. The only difference is when they begin. There's no difference in the order of months. There's no difference in the period of time which they fall. It's just which time you want to begin, either Nisan or Tishri. So this is the Jewish calendar. I'm showing Nisan years. This is the religious calendar. If I was going to do a calendar on Tishri years, it would start, number one would be Tishri. You'd basically take all this 7 through 12 and move up ahead of time. So Tishri would be 1, Sheshvan would be 2, Kislev 3, etc. Okay, but just for simplicity's sake, I'm looking at just Nisan years right now. So every 3 years, they put in an extra month. So every 3 years, they have an Adar 1 and Adar 2 to try to sync up their calendar, their lunar calendar, with the solar calendar. Okay, that's what drives all the holidays in Israel today. Any holiday, even their modern holidays, Israel Independence Day is driven by this lunar calendar. So much of the calendar reforms happen because of Easter. Easter is pretty sure this is true, Easter is the only holiday that we have that's not attached to the solar calendar. So I can go up to Kenny today and say, when is Easter this year? He'll say, oh. Kind of like all the other Jewish holidays, right? Easter is a lunar calendar date that falls somewhere within our solar calendar. That's why it varies around. Sometimes it's always between March something and April something. I forget exactly the dates that it has to be in. So that's why Easter jumps around, because it's a lunar calendar date. The simple definition of Easter is it's the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the spring equinox, but never at the beginning of Jewish Passover. Y'all got that? There's a test at the end. So this is just bonus material. Our calendar today, or our time today, it's dictated by the vernal equinox direction. Let's assume that this podium here is the sun. See if I can get my earth right here. Okay, this is one of the equinoxes. I know you probably can't see this, but see the equator? You see that line on here, right? At the vernal equinox, this equator, the line from the center of the sun to the center of the earth, is right on the equator. By definition, the first day of spring draws a line from the equator through the sun to the first point of Aries out there in space. Okay, and that's what actually legally defines our first day of spring, or the vernal equinox. It used to point at the first star in the Aries constellation, the first point of Aries, which was defined back in the intertestament period in 130 BC. It's now located in Pisces. So I'll show you the two different constellations up there. It used to be down here, and it now points up here somewhere. So it's drifted over the years, about 30 degrees since 130 BC. And like I said, the Earth does this. It wobbles, and that's why that's happening. Because of the wobble, sometimes the vernal equinox direction is specified at a certain time or epoch. And our epoch, the one it's specified at, is January 1st, 2000, at Greenwich Meridian by the International Astronomical Unit. And the year on that day was 365 days, 5 hours, 45 minutes, 45 seconds. The year, turns out, is slowed by 10 seconds since the first of AD, since Christ was born. The average decrease in the years due to the slowing of the Earth's rotation is a half second per century. The lunar month is there. The atomic time is now the standard the standard of time, and it's defined as 290 quadrillion oscillations of the atomic cesium atom. And we compensate the years by doing the standard Gregorian calendar stuff, adding a leap year every 4 years, not adding them based on the century, the 400-year dividing thing that I talked about. We still do all that, but we also add leap seconds here and there over time to keep everything up to date. Now, it turns out, how many remember the earthquake and tsunami back in 2011? Fukushima disaster, all that. Everybody remembers that. Awful, awful things were happening. That actually changed the length of our day. That actually changed it by 1.8 microseconds. Because the Earth now, because of that kick in the gut to the Earth, our Earth is now spinning faster. It's like a figure skater on ice as she's turning around, or he or she's turning around, and they pull in their arms. You know, like if you kick them, they pull in their arms, and that makes them spin faster. So that added 1.8 microseconds to the Earth right now. So our days are getting shorter. So that means we'll live more days, right? Except you have to have 500,000 days before it equals a second. Now, so I've talked about calendar time. Let's talk about weeks now, why the weeks have 7 days. Well, this goes back to the creation of the universe by God. 6 creation days and 1 day of rest on Shabbat. By the way, Sabbath, if you go to Israel, they won't understand if you say Sabbath. So they talk about Shabbat. The week has no astronomical analog like years, months, or days do, because it's just kind of a random thing, and they base that on planets, essentially, and I'll show you that in just a minute. The Romans initially adopted an 8-day week. The Assyrians had a 6-day week. The Egyptians a 10-day week, and the Chinese a 15-day week. Everything's kind of random, like I said. The 7-day week was in use in Babylon around 700 BC, but it was officially adopted by the Roman Emperor Constantine in the AD 320s. But the 7-day week did not come into Britain until the Anglo-Saxon conquest of the 5th century AD. So Nabu in Babylon was a god of theirs, became Mercurius in Rome, the god of war. That became Woden in Britain. That became Wednesday, Woden's Day, to us. And we'll have a whole series of those. All the days of the week are basically the planets. When we get over here to Anglo-Saxon days, this Luna is moon, moon day, sun day. Tu was a Anglo-Saxon god, I don't remember of what, but Tu's day. Woden's day became Wednesday, Thor's day, Freya's day, Friday, and Saturday. So you see the progression of time from the Babylonians, the Romans, to the Anglo-Saxons, and finally to us today. Again, that has no bearing on what the heavens are doing, with how the earth is rotating, or anything like that. Now, the weird start of Jewish days. The Jews based their days on the sundown to sunup method. What does that mean? They look in the sky, they used to, now they have tables and I guess an internet site that takes care of this for you, but they used to look in the sky, and as soon as the rabbi saw 3 stars appear in the sky, he would say, "Yea, verily, it's now tomorrow." You know what? They still do that. If you try to get a cab on Friday night in Jerusalem, which we tried, you're going to pay a bunch of money because the Orthodox Jews don't drive anymore. You got to get an Arab driver, you got to get a Jew that doesn't care if you're going to get a cab on Friday night, because that is Sabbath. Now, wait, Sabbath is Saturday. Well, I've always, all my life, Sabbath, Saturday. No, Friday night. Starts at Friday night. Sabbath ends on Saturday night when the first 3 stars appear. Another reason why it's important to study all this. So, in my book, I have a figure here. Sunset is defined as when the middle of the sun is on the horizon. Okay, so it's not when, if you say sunset is when the very bottom of the sun touches the horizon, you're wrong. The sunset is when the middle of the sun is on the horizon. There's 3 different twilights. Civil twilight is when the sun is 6 degrees below the horizon. And at the end of civil twilight is about when the Jewish day begins every time. That's about when the 3 stars, you can see the 3 brightest stars in the heavens at that time. You then have nautical twilight, when the sun is between 6 and 12 degrees. Then you have astronomical twilight, when the sun is between 12 and 18 degrees. And then after that, you have dark. I think that's the official word of that. Now, the Jews name their days just based on day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, Shabbat. Yom, Shabbat. Yom, day. Rishon, 1, day 1. Yom Shnai, day 2. Yom Shishli, day 3. That's some of these I can't pronounce. Yom Shishi, day 6. Yom Shabbat, Sabbath day. Very simple. You don't have to worry about Roman gods and all that. Very, very simple. Okay. Oh, we might be able to make it if I hurry. Not that I've been not hurrying already. So, Jewish Bible feasts that you read about, I mentioned this before. If you talk about Passover, it always starts on twilight of the day before. So you look at a Jewish calendar and Passover is, I don't know, April 12th or something. Well, that really starts on April 11th on our calendar at twilight. So it's really confusing when you start reading the Bible and trying to figure out all this stuff. So Holocaust Memorial Day this year, Holocaust Memorial Day is on April 24th, but it starts on April 23rd at twilight. Sabbath start on Friday evenings, and on 2025 there will be convergence of the start of Passover and the start of Shabbat. This causes much confusion. Jews will eat their Passover meal on April 11th after sundown, which is really Passover. So there are compelling arguments against this Jewish reckoning of days, and I have some of that argument in the chapter that I took out of the book. I'll publish that one of these days. So see the calendar on the following page, and I realize I should have blown this up better because you can't see it at all. But notice Fridays and Saturdays over here. Notice this shaded yellow area? That shows Shabbat starts on Friday evening and goes till Saturday evening. It's not a midnight to midnight thing at all. April 12th, that's good choice there. April 12th, Passover lines up with Shabbat. Even their modern holidays, this Israel, I know you can't read that because I can barely read it here. This Israel Immigration Day starts on the 7th at twilight and ends on the 8th at twilight. So they're very serious about their lunar calendar, even following it still today. Roman time. Now we see this a lot in the New Testament. Jesus said, aren't there 12 hours in a day in John? And it was the third hour, about 9 a.m. when they crucified him. And we see that time and time again throughout the New Testament. Now the Roman time, interestingly enough, was actually 12 hours daytime, 12 hours night. Not like ours though, because during the winter, their time was 50 minutes per hour of daylight for their hour during the winter time, and 71 minutes during the summer. So their hour, the length of their hour varied by the time of the year. They always had 12 hours in daylight and 12 hours in nighttime. If you were a night watchman in the Romans, always choose the summertime, because your night watch is going to be a lot shorter. You're going to have 50-minute hours instead of 71-minute hours. So beware of some nuances in the translations. We're going to see this a lot when we talk about money. But this is a particular example of nuance in the translation. The NRSV, which I like a lot because it has the Apocrypha in it, a modern version of the Apocrypha, and we'll talk about that a lot later too. The NRSV says, from noon on, darkness came over the face of the earth, over the land until 3 in the afternoon. The King James says, from the 6th hour, darkness came until the 9th hour. So the King James is actually more technically correct here, because when did this happen? Well, we know kind of when it happened, but we don't know exactly when it happened, so we don't know exactly how long the hour was. So it was not necessarily 9 o'clock. It could have been 8:52 that it happened. Again, nuances of translations. We'll see kind of this gamut as we talk about money. Translations that translate very precisely, like in this case the King James does. 6th hour, that's what it really meant, the 6th hour Roman, the 6th Roman hour, okay? Others translate noon. In the money world, some things translate very, very carefully. A denarius, that was a Roman piece of money. Others say, well, it was $42 or whatever. Others might say something else. So again, the nuances of the translation kind of make a difference and change with time. For example, the Roman I'm sorry, the English might. The widow put in her 2 mites. What does that mean? We don't know. Well, we will know when we get to that lesson on money later on in the quarter. First mechanical clocks came in 1300s AD. Ante-meridian AM and post-meridian didn't come into use until 1563. There are 4 different Greek words for time in the New Testament. There's chronos, which is the word we think of as time. 53 occurrences of that in the New Testament. Clock time or sequential time. Then Herod, when he secretly called the wise men, determined from them what chronos the star appeared. Now I did not bring it up here, but I have it back there with Shelley. But I have an interlinear Hebrew, Greek, English Bible back there. So if you want to see that, it actually shows up chronos. In the Greek, it's chi, rho, omicron, nu, omicron, final sigma. And that was later on associated with the god Cronus. Kairos, used 86 times, it means the right or appropriate time. I need more me time. I need more kairos. You know, that's not a specific time. I need more me time. I need more fun time, more family time. The time, Mark 1:15, the time kairos has come, he said. The kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe the good news. Ecclesiastes 3:18, to everything, that's really popular, familiar verse. To every kairos, there is a season. And a kairos to every purpose under heaven. A kairos to be born, a kairos to die, a time, you know, it's a more general feeling of time. Another couple of definitions of words, time words in the New Testament, aion. Used 128 times in the New Testament, everlasting eternity or age, the infinite lapse of time. Whoever speaks a word against the Son of Man will be forgiven, but whoever speaks against the Holy Spirit will not be given either in this age, aion, or in the aion to come. Atomus, used only once in the New Testament, and it is an instant of time, a very instant of time. Christ's second coming will transpire in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. I know I've kept you a couple minutes late. This is the last chart, I promise, for today. The subject of dating historical documents is very complex. If you're a student of this kind of thing, you'll run into this all the time, and I did. If you study the Roman Empire, you will run into terms such as AUC, the founding of the city, AD, Antedium, Calends, I's, Nomes periods. If you study historical dates in the literature before the writer observed the Gregorian calendar, which I have, you'll run into Julian calendar versus Gregorian calendar offsets that you have to deal with. If you study Jewish holidays feast, you must understand the Jewish feasts and holidays are based on a lunar calendar, and they're based on this weird start of their day at twilight. The Bible has multiple methods for days and times. The Jews start at sundown, the Greeks start at sunup, and always have 12 hours a night. Later on, the midnight to midnight thing came along. And as we said, there's multiple Greek words for time. If you search online for a term like when something happened, say, for example, when Nebuchadnezzar conquered and destroyed Jerusalem. Well, he did it in 586 BC if you go to BibleStudy.org, or he did it in 587 BC if you go to Wikipedia.org. Well, he only did it once, so which date is right? Well, somebody needs to write a book. If you're young and you have a bunch of years left, someone needs to write a book on time and how to extract times out of Bible. Well, we know that it was in the 4th month of Zedekiah's 11-year reign. Well, there's a lot of discontinuity about when the beginning of his reign was. And that's why there's discontinuity in these two times here. All right, so next week we're going to pick up a bunch of random stuff that we didn't talk about today, and we'll hopefully finish up chapter 1. Thank you all for being here. Sorry I went in a little over. I'll try not to do that every time, but I probably will. We'll see y'all in 2 weeks. Thank you.